that was full of lies and misinformation. So why is there so much interest all of a sudden in Mexico now? If you translate.
Hace muchos años la única información que los estadounidenses teníamos en México era lo que nos informaban los medios tradicionales corporativos. Ahora tenemos acceso a información que no depende de estos medios. ¿Y por qué ahora tenemos acceso a estos medios?
Jose Luis, Kurt.
You want to start with that one, Jose Luis?
Sure, absolutely. It's interesting because, one of the reasons I personally made the decision to move back to Mexico after living abroad for what has mostly been most of my life was precisely to be able to contribute in the way that I felt that I could best do so through my English language skills about what's happening in Mexico. And Laura is going to talk about this a little bit afterwards in the second part of today's activities. But one of the things that I did want to highlight is the fact that, we were really disappointed with some of the mainstream media coverage of Mexico. And that gap has to be filled, right? We cannot trust the mainstream media to do an accurate job of representing the country. And there's a lot of reasons why that ends up being the case. And so instead of just being unhappy with it, we decided that we had to do something about it.
Jose Luis just wondered if you wanted to translate for yourself before you go on too long.
No, it's going to be too difficult to do that, and I think we have too little time. Entonces, le ofrezco una disculpa a todos los que están ahí acompañándonos y que no hablan inglés, pero pues como estamos transmitiendo aquí en vivo, creo que va a ser un poquito difícil hacerlo así de manera simultánea. Es que nos habían contado que iba a ser simultánea ahí con un equipo, pero resulta que no funcionó. Entonces les ofrezco una sincera disculpa, pero yo creo que va a ser imposible hacerlo de esa manera. Pero bueno, obviamente tendremos otras oportunidades para poder platicar en español y bueno, dado la situación, también les invito con mucho gusto a sintonizar Sin Muros. Ese sí es un programa que se transmite en español, que es parte de lo que estamos haciendo en el canal 11, y ahí sí, todas las semanas, todos los martes a las 8 de la noche, hora central, hora de la Ciudad de México, ahí tenemos programación en español, donde pues de nuevo pueden escuchar todas nuestras opiniones, nuestro análisis de la situación en México. Entonces, aquí en adelante voy a tener que seguir en inglés, unas disculpas. So I was saying, and so seeing the situation here in Mexico, where there was such poor coverage of what's happening in the country, it was actually the initiative of Kurt to say, hey, let's do a podcast. Let's do this. And it took some convincing because at the time I figured there was way too many podcasts out there, but there wasn't anything in English. And one of the most interesting things as we've been, doing this program for a year has been precisely that, the interest that has emerged as a result of the newfound vision towards what's happening in Mexico. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that there was very much, I would say, a deliberate active boycott of López Obrador and what López Obrador was trying to do in Mexico, because he seemed like the kind of figure that most people outside of Mexico did not comprehend and did not want to even bother trying to understand. And so in that case, what we saw was almost like an effort to leave him out of coverage of mainstream media. And so the difference, I think, has a lot to do with Claudia Sheinbaum. Kurt always tells this anecdote. I'll let him fill out the details of it. But basically, people used to go from wanting to basically ignore what's happening politically in the country to now asking constantly, who is Claudia Sheinbaum? What is she doing? I was chatting with a friend who lives in Toronto, Canada, and he said, I was talking to a friend. He couldn't remember her name, but he said, she always wears turtlenecks and she's always giving TED Talks on television. That's the kind of leadership that the world needs right now. And it's because I think the figure of Claudia Sheinbaum has been really, really important in terms of opening people's eyes up to what's happening here in the country. And I think the other factor is, frankly, people asking themselves questions as a result of the U.S. election, of seeing that there, the center-right Democrat Party wasn't able to defeat what was being called at the time sort of this anti-incumbency trend, this rising right wing or far right in the world. And so people look to Mexico, where not only had it been successful, but actually had been monumentally successful, winning a supermajority, expanding their support, and now enjoying levels of support that are historically never been seen before in Mexico. Not even López Obrador had the kind of support that Claudia does of 85% approval ratings. And so I think a lot of the factors have to do with the international thing, with the international context, and a few people finally kind of getting over these biases that they had about what's happening in the country, because there is a figure that they feel like they can connect better with through Claudia. And I'm not trying to take anything away from López Obrador. That's not my intention. I think we wouldn't be here without him. But certainly, I think there's something about Claudia that just makes it a little bit more palatable for the international audience. Kurt, I'll hand it over to you to share your thoughts on that.
Yeah, just to add a little bit to what Jose Luis was saying, our podcast itself, Soberania, was founded out of this cauldron of anger we had against U.S. coverage of Mexico, and specifically. As many of you know, I've been writing in Jacobin magazine on Mexico since 2018, monthly pieces on Mexico. And I really am thankful that Jacobin has given me that space to write on Mexico consistently and give consistent coverage, not just occasional coverage, not just one-off pieces, or not kind of the standard mainstream media hit pieces, but they've really, given me the space to be able to give a real analysis of long-term in Mexico. And that's something that's very rare in U.S. media, practically non-existent. So, a shout out to them for that. And this podcast began in January of 2024, right in the context of a whole series of real lies coming from the U.S. media. And the goal was to intervene directly in the Mexican presidential election last year. And this began with a hit piece in ProPublica, right? Which using or prostituting its good reputation that ProPublica has, came out with its article in the form of a question of, did the narco participate in AMLO's 2006 presidential campaign, right? No evidence, nothing to back it up, right? Just a straight out hit, right, by Tim Golden, former New York Times reporter, now in ProPublica, right, who then wiped his Twitter account after he did that, interestingly. And then from ProPublica, there was a piece in Deutsche Welle, there was a piece in Inside Crime, and then the New York Times played copycat in February of 2024 with an even worse piece, right? And these kinds of things have effects, right? Because when the ProPublica and the New York Times allege something, that then gives the permission for the Mexican media to jump and springboard in that and say, well, the New York Times said, and ProPublica said. So it becomes, a snowball effect of lies. And that was, added to by a whole bot campaign the goal of which was to bring those hit pieces into social media, right? So you'd see Narco AMLO, Narco Claudia, Narco Government, Narco Gobierno. All this on the basis of nothing, right? They tried to find a connection between the Narco and AMLO's 3 presidential campaigns. I mean, they've been trying for 25 years to find something, right? Which is why all of the pieces in the U.S. media were all cagey. They were saying, some people have said, other people have said that there were. Other reports have said that maybe there were videos of the president's sons receiving money from the narco. They never found these videos, right? I mean, this is the most irresponsible reporting you can imagine from the New York Times correspondent in Mexico, Natalie Kitrev. I mean, the worst, right? The worst. Totally irresponsible. And then you've seen them recently, Natalie Kitrev and Paulina Villegas, going into a supposed fentanyl lab in Sinaloa when it was very clearly not a fentanyl lab. It was not a fentanyl lab because they were in somebody's kitchen with Valentina salsas and beer cans, right? When, fentanyl vapors are mortal. They're very dangerous. And they tried to have us believe that just with a bandana around his face, they were cooking up fentanyl on a kitchen stove. Right? It was just kind of narco tourism journalism. Anyway, I could talk about that too much. But the point of all of this is to say that we started this podcast exactly in that kind of context. Now, we know that the U.S. media lies about everything. It lies about domestic matters. It lies about policing. It lies about Black Lives Matter. It lies about Europe. It lies about, foreign policy in general. But in this case, we felt that there was a gap with regards to Mexico. There have traditionally and historically been solidarity movements very active in the 80s when I was a kid with regards to what the Reagan administration was doing in Central America. That was a very active movement at the time, right? Which all, of course, linked up to Iran-Contra. There were very active movements to support the peoples who were fighting the dictatorships in the Southern Cone in the 70s. Solidarity movements with Chile, right? Solidarity movements with Argentina, right? And many others. But there wasn't one for Mexico. And it was really interesting. It was almost like Mexico was seen as being too close to the United States or too close to home, or people thought they already knew what they needed to know about Mexico, or there was a weird gap there, that there wasn't a solidarity movement. The Mexican public has been through hell and back over the last generation. We're talking about the devaluation of 1982. We're talking about all of the IMF structural adjustments of the 80s. We're talking about the wholesale privatization of the state in the 90s. We're talking about the tequila crisis of 1994. We're talking about the Fobaproa bank bailout of the 90s. We're talking about the drug war in the 2000s and 2010s. What hasn't the Mexican public had to put up with? 2 major devaluations, a structural adjustment program, a massive privatization of its entire state, and then a drug war. If there's any a country that there was need for this kind of international solidarity with, it was here, and it wasn't happening. It wasn't happening enough, let's say. Of course it was happening. But that's why these efforts like the Mexico Solidarity Project and Soberania and other things have gotten going and very happily gained momentum over the last few years.
Thank you so much, Kurt. So I think now we will hand it over to you there in Guanajuato. If there's anybody who's ready to ask a question, if you want to ask it in Spanish, I'll go ahead and translate it into English. I totally understand. And Mezu, can you let us know if there's anybody ready to ask a question? Otherwise, we have another one we can queue up here that we've prepared.
Go ahead.
Okay. First, just a quick thank you as a lifelong journalist and news person for deconstructing the stories in detail, paragraph by paragraph. I love that. Maybe you could get a telestrator like they used to use in the basketball games. And so but the thing I wanted to kind of let you comment on, we know about the ammunition weapons industry and how it affects the fentanyl situation from this side. But there's very little said in the media or almost anywhere about the late stage capitalism that has led to the demand. Not just the fact that there is demand, but that the fact that there's a direct connection between venture capitalists, such as our vice president, and others who dismantle the rural and small town economies where fentanyl is thriving. And I'm wondering if, since the Democrats don't seem to have any cojones, if there's any way to make that argument within the United States.
I'll go first on that if you want, Jose Luis. Just very briefly, I think this is one of the great advantages of Claudia Sheinbaum. Jose Luis was talking in his first comments about how Sheinbaum appears to be cutting through in her communication strategy with the U.S. public in a way that López Obrador didn't as much. López Obrador was the great communicator to the Mexican public and one of the best political communicators I've ever seen. Probably the best. But when you talk about cutting through to the U.S. public, there's something that Claudia is doing there that's interesting. And she's been making that case that you just said, right? That all the blame goes on Mexico, but they haven't focused on, right, Big Pharma, the Sackler family, Purdue Pharma, OxyContin, right, the whole very produced opioid epidemic, including Big Pharma and, doctors who went along with it. And they themselves were building off of the deindustrialization of the United States over the last 40, 50 years, right? So you deindustrialize the country, you lead to a situation where people are desperate and living in very precarious circumstances, and then you fill them with OxyContin. And then that opens the door to, fentanyl and whatever else, right? So I think Claudia Sheinbaum has, Mexico's really taken the media offensive on that, in the sense that They produced a series of small documentaries talking about the history of Big Pharma and OxyContin, which a lot of the Mexican public didn't know, and now they do. Talking about the economic interest behind the arms trade and how arms fled into Mexico, precisely because there's no checks on this at all coming from the U.S. side, right? And it's actually, I think, federally illegal for them to even trace what arms go into Mexico. I mean, it's just, we know the power that the NRA has, right? And then, the other point that the Sheinbaum administration has been making very consistently is that fentanyl is trafficked into the United States, and this is even the Cato Institute. This is not some left-wingers like us. This is the Cato Institute saying this. 80% of fentanyl is trafficked into the United States by U.S. citizens at legal border crossings. And that's just a fact. So the other point there that I think that the key to the puzzle there is exactly that. How venture capital, I'm getting this wrong, venture capital, there we go, create their own conditions for these crises that then, right, there are politicians that are in their pay purport to then fix, right?
Oh.
I don't know, Jose Luis, you want to jump in?
Well, why don't we take another question? But
I think we'll take another question. Yeah, Kurt nailed it there. I'm just handling the back end stuff, responding to messages there as well. So, but please, let's get another question from the crowd.
I might do a follow-up question on that, on the arms trade. Now that Trump has designated the cartels as terrorist organizations, Claudia Sheinbaum has used that as a way to strengthen her arguments against the gun trade. I wondered if you could comment on that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Mexico was very against the FTO designation for very obvious reasons, because cartels are not terrorist organizations. They don't have a political end. They're multinational businesses, right? And Mexico very well knows that an FTO designation is one step closer to a military intervention. So, of course, Mexico was against that. But now that it's happened, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade, Mexico has realized that there's a certain advantage to the FTO designation, because that means that people from the U.S. side who are aiding and abetting cartels are now legally liable in a way that they weren't before. And that means U.S. banks that launder cartel money, right? U.S. and international banks like HSBC, like Bank of America, as we've seen, right? And also the U.S. gun manufacturers could be on the hook now for arming foreign terrorist organizations. Right? Mexico right now has a lawsuit that's just before the Supreme Court now, trying to hold U.S. gun makers liable for, like I said, right, all this U.S. weaponry that has flooded Mexico and caused all this violence. Very unlikely they're going to get a Supreme Court decision in their favor, but the fact that and actually that suit was before the FTO designation, but the fact that it's gotten there has, contributed to the debate in a way that it hadn't in a long time, right? And in Claudia's first phone call with Trump, she apparently got some kind of vague promise that they were going to try to tackle U.S. Arms trafficking flowing into Mexico. But that's exactly right. The FTO designation totally changes the scene. If you look at what happened with Mayo Zambada, one of the capos of the Sinaloa cartel, who was apparently kidnapped in some form by the U.S., that involves some kind of negotiation between the U.S. government and the Sinaloa cartel. That can't happen now with an FTO designation, because that would mean that the United States is now negotiating with a foreign terrorist organization, or they're just going to do it anyway and ignore the FTO designation. But it changes the territory in a lot of ways.
Great, and I would just add that, I'll get you 1 second. I would just add that in the United States, we cannot sue gun manufacturers. There's a law that protects the gun manufacturers, but it's significant that Mexico can, because it's not in the U.S. So
well, that's exactly what's in dispute in this case. Mexico is saying, well, that law only covers domestic people, but we're a foreign country.
Yeah,
that's what's being decided right now. If that blanket immunity covers also international cases.
Great argument, though, Bill.
The only thing I would add to that is that, I think, for example, there's a question here about media literacy, about mainstream media coverage. I think one of the things that often doesn't get enough coverage is precisely this issue around the narrative of the so-called drug war. And in the case of these ongoing negotiations around the tariffs, I've seen some chatter on social media as part of the kind of the right-wing media sphere in the United States that, well, of course, he's going to have to do something. This is the only thing that's gotten Mexico to finally take action around this. I mean, of course, all of us here in this room understand that that's a lie, that Mexico has done, in fact, too much, especially when you think about the restriction of human mobility that Mexico is carrying out at the behest of the United States in its southern border against migrants and asylum seekers. But it's certainly doing a lot, right? I mean, if you look at the numbers, encounters at the border between the US and Mexico are down, fentanyl seizures inside Mexico are up, and that means a reduced supply to the United States. And of course, always emphasize the fact that, it can't only be supply side. There has to be more done on the demand side. But this whole issue around the lawsuit around guns and the demand by Mexico to have the US do more around this is also important in terms of that narrative battle. Because if somebody comes to you and says, well, Mexico isn't doing enough, you can point to that. Look, what is the US doing about guns? These organized crime groups are as powerful as they are, in part because of the money and the money that they are able to handle as a result of the laundering that happens mostly in the United States, but of course on both sides, that goes unrestricted. Too big to jail was actually one of the phrases that was floating around there. HSBC was specifically sanctioned as a result of its activities in laundering drug money. And the other one is the guns. So if you ever hear somebody say, well, Mexico isn't doing enough and that's why all this is happening and they deserve the tariffs and that's the only thing that works, that seems to get the answer him with that, which is that, well, what is the US doing in terms of its part, in addition to the fact that it does very little to address the public health crisis around opioids, but also to actually restrict the guns that actually enable the kind of violence and destruction that these organized crime groups are able to carry out. There has to be a shared responsibility. And I think that's one of the things that we can really drive home as activists, because it's actually the perfect argument, right? You leave these critics without a response when you tell them, if you're not doing enough, how can you possibly put yourself in a position to demand more of Mexico, which is already demonstrably, through the facts and figures, like the ones that the president shared on Thursday, that it is in fact doing a lot to attend to this issue, because Mexico wants to have this solved as well. We want to deal with the insecurity crisis that is generated by the demand for narcotics inside of the United States, in the same way that people inside the United States legitimately, they have my sympathy and my empathy around people who are dealing with addictions. Like, this has to be taken care of. It's in the interest of actually both countries, but it can't only be a demand on Mexico. It can't be this asymmetric relationship. And I think that's where we as activists can actually intervene with a very solid argument, I would say.
And just very quickly to end on that, the perspective from the Mexico side over the last month has been, they asked us to do A, B, and C. We did A, B, and C. I think actually Jose Luis said you could argue probably doing too much. And then he tries to slap the tariffs on anyway. What incentive is there for anyone to ever cooperate with the US on anything with that kind of attitude? What incentive is there for them to do anything with their number one trading partner? Do this, that, and that. Okay, we'll do this, that, and that. No, you get tariffs anyway. We'll just dangle it over you from month to month, just like that. Okay? The damage to diplomatic relations is incalculable, and it's really curious that it was the United States which put Mexico in the free trade straitjacket in the first place in the 90s, and now it's the US which is pushing them out of it and pushing them into other options, both economically and diplomatically around the world, which Mexico should have been doing before anyway, and now it's getting a little push in that direction, ironically.
All right, let's turn it back to the crowd.
Oh, yeah, we've got to.
I just questions. Yeah.
Oh.
So I just wanted to say that Mexico has responded to the bullying in the United States around the lawsuit by punching back harder. They've added counts to their lawsuit. And even though Lance is saying it's an attack on the Second Amendment, Mexico is not backing down, they're actually pushing forward. But I had a question about Mexico's relationship to the pink tide in Latin America. there's 12 countries which have, and this is happening nowhere else in the world, that have stood up to one degree or another, moved to the left, moved in populist direction against Yankee imperialism. And we can anticipate that the pressure on Mexico over the next 4 years will continue to be very intense. But Mexico is a key element of that pink tide. It is the largest country, the strongest, with strong leadership, strong support from its population. And I wonder if you've had a chance to really talk about this, Mexico's impact on the pink tide, because Rubio is from a Cusano family, and he wants to restore Latin America as a total neo-colony of Yankee imperialism. So this is something that I think is critically important. It doesn't get discussed very often.
Do you want to
You
go
want
first
to,
on that?
Jared? I'll jump in on that.
How will Mexico respond? What will Mexico's role be in this movement in Latin America?
So I'm just putting in the chat here the question, because some people are saying they can't quite hear. Just hello, Bill. Nice to see you. He was telling us about Mexico playing a key role in this kind of new pink tide that Trump wants to restore Latin America to the status as a neo colony. The first thing I would say to that is that sometimes your rivals, your opponents politically, your enemies in the case of U.S. imperialism, kind of do you favors. And I think a lot of what's been happening recently around these tariff threats of basically abandoning sort of the central pillars of neoliberal orthodoxy, something that the past governments of Mexico very happily, willingly signed on to. And I'm talking about the North American Free Trade Agreement back in '94. And of course, its modern iteration now. The fact that they're the ones who are breaking it up actually gives us a fantastic opportunity to really ask precisely those kinds of questions of what is Mexico's role in the region and who should be its key allies. Obviously, right now, Mexico's number one trading partner is the United States, and it is for the United States as well. And that's the kind of relationship that cannot and should not, arguably, be dismantled over a short period of time, because it would be devastating. I mean, these economies are deeply integrated in the sense that, it's said that auto parts will cross the United States, Mexico, Canada, United States border upwards of 8 times before it's actually put into a vehicle that's actually out on the lot and sold and made available on the market. And so disrupting that kind of economic production chain would be really devastating, and it would severely affect, the livelihoods of working class people here in Mexico, because Mexico, willingly at one point signed on to be a manufacturing hub for North America as a source of trained but also low cost labor. And so I think that's also why you see such a fervent defense, even from a fervent leftist like Claudia Sheinbaum in this case, who I remind you, López Obrador used to say, be careful with her because she's bougie compared to me, of somebody who comes from a very strong left-wing tradition, suddenly finding themselves in this curious situation. We're not really defending the free trade agreement. We're defending the economic model that we have inherited and that we obviously do need to move away from. And that is where I would answer your question in the sense that the circumstances are forcing us to have to reconsider that. And one of the things that we've always been stressing, on the various programs where we were asked our opinion is precisely that, is that, López Obrador in 2018 kind of had to pick up all the pieces, rebuild the state. I mean, there was basically no real capacity to actually be able to deliver welfare programs to the population. But obviously, we've had 6 years of progress. But on the international scene, he also had to rescue the community of Latin American and Caribbean states from the dustbin, which basically had been deliberately destroyed in the same way that UNASUR was deliberately destroyed by the right wing in the region, because they understand that regional unity is really critical to the development of a bloc, of an anti-imperialist, pro-sovereignty bloc here in Latin America that actually can rival the economic and political power of the United States. And so there really is a very important opening here in terms of diversifying their trade partners, diversifying the kinds of trade relationships. One of the things that I think we need to reintroduce into the conversation is something that actually happened during the first pink tide with Hugo Chavez, who created the ALBA TCP agreement. And the interesting thing about the Tratado de Comercio de los Pueblos, or the People's Trade Agreement, was that it actually wasn't even commerce dealt in dollars or in other monetary instruments, but actually there was a lot of bartering of, for example, Venezuela had oil and Cuba had doctors. And so the trade was done along those bases and not necessarily an exchange, right? Because this is an old communist idea of actually putting the emphasis not on exchange value, but on use value, and actually exploring those kinds of relationships with the rest of Latin America, with Mexico playing a leading role. And before I hand it over to Kurt, so to give his 2 cents here, I would also add, for example, the dismantling of U.S. aid, I actually think is an opportunity, because, many of us here in the room are very familiar with U.S. soft power and the role that it plays in advancing U.S. imperialism. And I think the fact that they have weakened themselves. Actually, there was a story in the Times a couple of days ago about how upset Marco Rubio was because he thought he was going to have this huge agency with thousands of employees to go around and engage in regime change efforts through U.S. soft power. And suddenly Elon Musk came in and destroyed it for him. He did us a favor by doing that. Now, obviously, there's a humanitarian impact, and the rest of the world should step up and fill in that gap and to provide legitimate humanitarian aid to countries that need it, that isn't conditioned to the interests of U.S. imperialism and U.S. Foreign policy. But also, without soft power, they are weaker. Obviously, they want to replace it with hard power, with violence, with neocolonialism, as was said here in the room. But, that is an opening for us, and we have to take advantage of it by doing what we're doing right now. Building strength between not just states, not just governments, but people to people, of actually understanding what those kinds of links can look like. That's, again, one of the things that I think was most exciting about ALBO is ALBO Movimientos Sociales, about these spaces where social movements can convene and coordinate. One of the things that I actually was critical of in terms of everything that's played out over the last couple of weeks has been the fact that SELAC did not meet. There was a meeting called for SELAC, and it didn't happen because of interference from right-wing countries. But even if that's going to happen, then we should have it anyway. The way that López Obrador had an ad hoc gathering in Palenque to talk about migration from a different perspective. That's where Mexico can play a leading role, and I think absolutely needs to.
Yeah, so just to add to that a little bit, what we're talking about here, the dream of Simón Bolívar, very clearly, right? This is the Bolivarian dream of a united Latin America, right? To be able to stand up to both Europe and the incipient United States back in the 1820s. And the goal of the Monroe Doctrine, the stated goal has been to keep Europe out of, affairs of the Americas. The real goal has always been to keep, obviously, Latin America subservient to the United States, and that has been through divide and conquer strategies, right? That's been always the goal. So it's actually López Obrador made a very memorable speech in 2021 on the occasion of Bolivar, right? Talking about exactly this, right? And the very noxious and effects of the Monroe Doctrine. And now we even hear language about wanting to resurrect the Monroe Doctrine and have a Monroe 2.0, which is why it's really ironic that Rubio is getting cuts to his own ability to do so, as Jose Luis mentioned, right? So Mexico sat out the first pink tide, right? Because it was the time of Vicente Fox, right? And then Felipe Calderón. So that whole first tide, which was built out of just repugnance and disgust by Baby Bush, that nude U.S. imperialism at the time with Rumsfeld and the invasion of Afghanistan and the invasion of Iraq, right? That repugnance against that very nude imperialism, plus the fact that the United States was very all occupied in the Middle East, gave that space for the pink tide, the first pink tide, to grow. And Mexico sat that one out. So now we're in a kind of, right, and then in the 2010s, there was the reaction against the pink tide, the Lima Group and, right, all these attempts to create these counter organizations to organizations like UNASUR and ALBA. So now in the 2020s, there's a kind of second pink tide in a way, right? There are progressive governments in Brazil and Mexico at the same time, and Colombia and Uruguay, right? But then you have the other side of it, right? You have Milei in Argentina, you have the constitutional coup in Peru that overthrew Pedro Castillo. You've got Noboa in Ecuador, who will try to reelect himself in the most, fraudulent conditions coming up in a few weeks. So, the situation is a little bit difficult. And the problem also is the United States has locked in free trade agreements, not just with Mexico and Canada, but they also have them with Peru, with Chile, with Colombia. Obviously, Southcom is all over, right? Trying to recreate that neo-colony here that Bill mentioned, right? You see, they're now putting a base in the Galapagos Islands in Ecuador, right? And now they have free reign to basically use Ecuador as their colony there. So it's going to require a lot of work, a lot of diplomatic work, a lot of economic work, a lot of imagination, a lot of vision, a lot of fortitude, a lot of kind of good nationalism as opposed to the bad nationalism, U.S. style, right? To overcome a lot of these hurdles in the road to greater Latin American integration. The fact that Mexico is involved this time when it wasn't last time is a great benefit. The fact that Mexico is involved this time is a great benefit. It's the biggest Spanish-speaking country in the hemisphere. It's got 126 million people, and Mexico has traditionally played a leadership role before the neoliberal era, right? We're talking about back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Even the PRI had a relatively independent foreign policy to the United States. So there's a basis for this here, but there's going to be a lot of work too.
Mezu, let us know how are things looking there. Do we have time for one more question? I'm certainly happy to take another one. If we can get the person asking the question to get a little bit closer to the camera so folks who are online can hear as well. And I'll make sure you're unmuted here.
We have International Women's Day today, and I just wanted to see if you all had a statement about that.
All right, International Women's Day. Kurt, did you happen to watch the program this morning from National Palace?
I did. And actually, the march is going right by here, a few blocks away from where I'm sitting in the Centro Histórico of Mexico City. Right. So today is 8M, right? And that's a huge deal around the world. It's a huge deal in Mexico. The Zocalo will be filled right now, right? With women from all over the country here in Mexico. And it's a very important moment. Right? It's a very, very, very important moment. There have been important strides made over the last several years. We're talking about the legalization of abortion in Mexico. Ironically, Mexico now has more liberal abortion laws than the United States. So you now see the phenomenon of women crossing over the border into Mexico to get that needed care. Right? We're talking about a whole series of measures with regards to, for example, here in Mexico City, women's prosecutors and women's only prosecutors, what do you call it, MAPs, right? Public prosecutors for women's affairs. We're talking about a women's only hotline, but we're also talking about labor issues and things where the 4T still has to advance, right? Like reducing the work week, right? Because as we all know, the work week here is far too long. Women have to do, 48 or sometimes hour or sometimes longer work week in Mexico and then go home and do another turn, right, of work. We're also talking about the feminicides in Mexico, which is still way too high. Right? That's a plague that's been happening since the maquiladoras came in Ciudad Juarez and other border cities. You began to see a plague of feminicides at the border in the 90s and disappearance of women, and that remains. So there's a lot to be happy with regards to what's been going on over the last several years with regards to women's rights, with regards to parity in Congress, parity in the cabinet, parity in the courts. They're way ahead of the U.S. with regards to parity, gender parity across the government, right? And quotas. I mean, it has to be. It's enforced parity, and that's good. Parity on party lists. Obviously, the first woman president and a very strong one. All that's cause for celebration. But there's also a long way to go, and so it's very right and very important that they be out there protesting just 2 blocks away from here.
The thing I would add to that is that there was certainly, admittedly, tension between the feminist movement and the López Obrador government, and I think López Obrador, he's a politician from a different generation, and I think was unnecessarily combative towards some of these and wanting to ascribe it to an opposition conspiracy. There's actually some truth to that. The movement is most certainly infiltrated in some ways by opportunistic, liberal, feminist politicians. There's one who's the local borough mayor here in Mexico City, as an example. But that doesn't discredit the movement, and I don't want to give that impression whatsoever. The movement has legitimate demands, right, around reproductive rights, around actual, material improvements for women in Mexico, and of course around the crisis of femicides. And so, one of the things that I think is important about Claudia Sheinbaum, and of course, one thing is the fact that, yes, she's the first woman president, and, Mexico managed, famously sexist, machista Mexico managed to elect a woman with an overwhelming mandate long before even the United States could, despite the kind of, condescending attitude that I think certain liberal feminists inside the United States have towards Mexico. But, she's not Margaret Thatcher. She's not Kim Campbell. She's Claudia Sheinbaum. So she's a leftist woman, a woman cut, a red diaper baby cut from the cloth of political struggle, who as a child used to visit political prisoners in Lecumberri prison, right? Who was active in high school around a movement that sought to build links between the cities and the countryside, who was active in one of the most important student mobilizations since 1968 in Mexico to resist efforts to kind of the creeping privatization and the limiting of access to higher education, all the work that she did under López Obrador's government in the city, all of the work she did as mayor, progressive issues, like, for example, around trans rights, for example, can be pretty thorny in an admittedly conservative country like Mexico. And I know I've read feminist critics of Claudia Sheinbaum who said, well, there are people who are anti-trans in her coalition and in her inner circle. And I would say to that is that, but, Claudia was actually one of the best governors when it came to that issue. There is one clinic in the entire country that's focused on health needs of trans people. And it's here in Mexico City, and it's public. And so it gives you an example of actually on the ground in the practice of what she does. She's also been accused of repressing the movement because of, admittedly, now I'm not here to kind of criticize diversity of tactics. The movement will decide what it wants to tolerate. What I will say is that, yes, there's certainly an element that deliberately seeks to provoke, based on their own logic, their own ideology, one that is very much inspired by sort of anarchist organizing and anarchist thinking, of directly confronting and provoking the state. And so, just this week, they were saying, how can the first woman president possibly put up these metal gates up in front of National Palace? Well, that's because if she doesn't, they burn the door down like they have in past years, right? And so, these are kind of the realities on the ground of what it means. But Claudia Sheinbaum created the first cabinet level position for women, passed what is essentially the Equal Rights Amendment, its equivalent, formal equality in the law, but critically is also delivering material improvements to women, which I think is also one part that often gets undersaid. Yeah, one of the things she said was the pension for seniors, which is one of the most popular social programs here in Mexico. She's like, there are reasons why women are disadvantaged in the economic workplace because of this problem of the double exploitation. And this is the language she uses in the streets, at the rally, saying, and therefore we have to actually compensate that. And so while men have to wait until they're 65, under my government, women 60 and up will eventually be eligible for this program. There's a siren going by, apologies. And so there's been this rollout starting this year. Women age 64 are eligible. Next year, it's 63, until eventually by the end of her term, women age 60 will be able to access this universal pension in a way to kind of begin to address, to have those material improvements. Indigenous women are eligible immediately, as of now, at age 60, for this universal pension, which is life-changing for a lot of families. So these are kind of some of the things that I think often aren't talked about. They only talk about things that I think suit a certain narrative. And again, I'm not trying to say that the criticisms aren't legitimate, but there's more to it than I think oftentimes is portrayed, particularly in mainstream media. And finally, I would say that to add to what Kurt said, is that I think a lot of it is also kind of the working class agenda, which favors working class women. And so that means that in this era where we are potentially facing facing economic disruption as a result of the decisions of Donald Trump and his emphasis on wanting to implement tariffs and change kind of the funding model for the federal government there. Even if this does come to pass, although arguably it looks like Claudia has successfully negotiated an exit out of that, the emphasis needs to be on that, to develop the internal market here in Mexico, which is already happening with the Plan Mexico, it's called. It's the economic program. But even things like, I was listening to an economist, her name is Viri Rios, saying what we need to do is reduce the work week so that people have more time to contribute, to go out on the weekends and spend money. We need to raise the wage so that they have more money to spend, so that they can participate and actually kind of strengthen that economy that exists here and that isn't reliant on exports. So looking at the time and looking at Meizu with a look of it's almost time to wrap up, I'm going to hand it over back to her. I know there were some questions here in the chat that we didn't get to. I apologize for that, but I want to thank everybody for connecting to the
just
program
one
here.
very, very quick thing there.
Before I go away. Yeah, go ahead.
Just 1 second there.
5 more minutes, maybe.
Okay. Yeah. What's important to point out about the pension is that the Mexican pension is a universal pension. It's not like U.S. Social Security, where you have to have paid in a certain number of quarters. Because a lot of times, right, women in Mexico have worked in the informal sector and wouldn't have paid into a formal system, right? And also the 4T has passed aid to single mothers. And as we know, both in Mexico and the United States, the people who are most benefited by minimum wage increases, which have been annual 15 to 20% minimum wage increases, are working women. So that's why the labor part of it is so very important in that respect.
What? Oh, did I mute it again? Sorry.
No, it's okay. I mute you because of the feedback, but go ahead. We can hear you now.
Oh, no. Okay. No, I was going to say one of the reasons we love Soberania is because it's very detailed, very factual, historical, but also for those reasons lengthy. So I wish we had more time for questions, but you can tune into Soberania in the future, and also you can, well, we can probably give you access to ask them questions.
Oh, yes,
later.
absolutely.
So
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kurt and Luis. They were on standby at Canal 11, and we thank you for your time.
And just to say goodbye, thank you, everybody. I apologize we couldn't be there in person. As Meizu said, we were pulled in a lot of directions, and unfortunately, we had to change our plans at the last minute. But I promise that what we're doing here is for you, right? We don't make a lot of money. In fact, everything we're making, we're actually investing into building a nice new studio so that we can have a little bit more reliable programming for you as well. But we really love the interaction, right? We love when people leave comments. We love when people get in touch with us. Sometimes we're a little bit slow to respond, but I promise, Meizu has my number. You can give it out to anybody you want. Just tell me on WhatsApp and be like, I was at the conference and I have this question. We'll do our best to always include and address those. And again, also to the people in the chat who ask questions, thanks so much for the engagement. There's so much to talk about. There's never enough time, but we really do appreciate it. It's very much about having this connection with you and being able to interact. We're not celebrities. We don't want to be celebrities. It's always weird when people kind of ask for pictures and stuff like that. For me, we're just another humble soldier in this communications battle that we're carrying out to kind of say the truth about what's happening in Mexico and hopefully inspire people in the United States, above all, to understand that political transformation, revolutionary transformations are possible. And I think Mexico is a shining example of just how far and how profound these changes can actually be, even given all of the constraints of U.S. imperialism, of the inherited neoliberal state, all the rest of it. Thanks again. And thank you all for actually attending and making time to be there in Guanajuato and do this amazing work. Thank you. And I'll see some of you here. I'm sure some of you are coming here to Mexico. We'll have a chance to talk more and have these exchanges. Kurt will also show up as well, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'll see you in Mexico City.
Okay. Well, I don't know how to turn it off.
We'll say goodbye for now.
Okay, but here. Oh, I have to turn it off. Okay. So